So, welcome to what is effectively the back half of our class. Um, this module is on motivation. We'll talk about what motivation is, but for a brief moment, I sort of want to give you all a mental map of where the course has been and where we're going, because this module represents a shift into the more organizational psychology side of IO psychology. So this is what we've done in the semester thus far. We have job analysis, effectively linking everything we've talked about, from recruitment to selection, prediction, assessment, training, performance assessment, and training and development. We have a lot, and you can see some of these things appear here twice because they deserve their own little entry, but that's where we've been. And so this is the industrial psychology side of things. But and so in that way, it's that side is about how do we identify, select, and assess our employees so we can put people in the positions they are best suited for and that they can perform well in. And then how can we train and develop them to make sure that they are performing up to standards? And then how can we assess them so we can decide when training is appropriate, when termination or firing people is appropriate, and when and how much compensation is appropriate. So that's the industrial side of IO psychology. We're now shifting into the organizational psychology side of things. Now there is some overlap, or rather some concepts and ideas that feed into the organizational psychology side. So for example, a lot of what we talked about in terms of predicting performance and assessing applicants, as well as performance assessment a little bit, but we'll focus on these two right here, is related to organizational psychology, in the sense that we, when we're looking at organizational psychology, are looking at how people behave in the workplace and what social, situational, and individual factors lead them to behave that way. And now, while we can't necessarily predict based on what we do in a hiring procedure, how people will behave based on a situation, to some extent, what we're looking for are individual differences that we believe will impact their behavior in the workplace. For example, we talked about personality, how personality traits can influence how people behave in terms of their job performance, that conscientious people tend to perform really well across different jobs. And so that's how we can link some of what we talked about in the industrial side of IO psychology to what we are going to talk about now. That a lot of what we do in terms of selection is for the purpose of predicting who is going to behave in a way we want to in the workplace. But we can't 100% predict that. So in the organizational psychology side of things, we are going to discuss some of the other factors as well, the situational factors, for example, that can lead people to behave in different ways in an organization. So here's the organizational psychology side of things. It's a little bit dense, so I also tried to distill it a little bit. So the things in bold that we see here are, or rather the things in white are some of the things that relate to what we have been talking about in the past to some extent. So a lot of the things in terms of motivation, job attitudes, decision-making, stress and well-being, leadership, individual differences in performance, those are all things that presumably to some extent we can predict based on our assessment of job applicants. So when people are being hired for an organization or applying to be hired by an organization, we can try to measure their traits and individual differences to predict how motivated are they going to be, how likely is it that they are going to have and display certain job attitudes, how likely is it that they are going to be risky in their decision making. Those are all things that we can to some extent measure and predict. And all of those things have implications for how people behave on the job. Some of the other things that we have talked about thus far do also more directly relate to some of the things we're going to talk about in this class. I've already, we won't talk about performance on this side of the semester, but some of the things that we did talk about in performance, things like OCBs, CWBs, task performance, those will get brought up in terms of what things like motivation impact performance. Then we also have individual differences, which we also discussed and would normally fall under the heading of organizational psychology, but we talked about in the industrial side, things like ability and personality, those predictors we talked about before. Excuse me. Things like stress and well-being, as well as leadership, were also somewhat tangentially related to some topics that we talked about previously. Things like training and development can relate to leadership and stress and well-being, but here we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive on things like stress and well-being, as well as leadership. More, how does it impact people, and how can we identify good leaders, for example. So those are some of the connections between what we've done and what we're going to do for the remainder of the semester. Now, I should note that there are some themes listed here that will not get discussed in this semester. We just don't have the time. If you're interested, you should, in some of the things that won't get discussed, you should maybe head on over to the business school. I used to teach in a business school, and there, when I taught the business school version of this class, which is organizational behavior, we do a lot more on the organizational psychology side of things. So for example, we will not talk about conflict. We will talk about conflict, we will talk about conflict, but we won't talk about negotiation, for example. We won't talk about power in politics, for example. We also probably will only do a little bit of a dive into things like organizational culture and organizational climate. We also won't talk about organizational theory as well. That's just because we don't have the time. So if you're interested in those things, and also they don't get covered by the textbook, so I wouldn't want to overwhelm you all too much with things that aren't covered in the textbook. But if those are things that interest you, you should go see if in the business school they teach an organizational behavior class, because you will be well suited, and you'll probably do extremely well because you've taken this class, going and taking that one. If it's possible, talk to your advisors. So what is motivation? So motivation can be defined in a number of ways, but motivation generally refers to the forces that make us behave in one way or another. Our motivation energizes, directs, and sustains us. So our motivation gives us the energy, provides us with the effort to do something. It also directs that effort. So it provides an orientation. So when you have that energy, when you have that effort, and you're willing to use it to do something, your motivation, what you are motivated to do, therefore directs that effort to a specific behavior, a specific activity, a specific goal. Your motivation also sustains that effort. So when you are motivated, you are more likely to expend a lot of effort for a long time. If you're not motivated, you're not likely to spend a lot of effort, nor are you likely to spend a lot of effort for a long time. So being motivated basically directs our behavior. And in that way, all of our behavior is motivated. You may not think that way, because we have this concept, much like job attitudes, which we will talk about, I think, next module. A common person's concept of what motivation is, and that when people have motivation, they are energetic. But energizing someone just means that you are giving them the effort to do something. So for example, someone can be motivated to sit on their couch all day and watch Netflix. That is a product of motivation, just as much as getting up and running a marathon is a product of motivation. The thing about our motivation is, though, that it takes on multiple forms, and how you can have motivation and motivational factors that manifest, that become apparent in things that people would say are unmotivated. But really what that is it's not motivated in the way we want it to be. So someone who's watching Netflix is motivated to watch Netflix. Someone who is running a marathon is motivated to run a marathon. So all of our behavior is motivated. It's just we all have different motivations, and that's why we engage in different behaviors. So this is something that does not appear in the textbook, but I think it's really important to understand the relationship between some of the concepts that we've talked about and some of the things that we will continue to talk about throughout this semester. So when we're talking about performance, and here performance can be specific to task performance, but it can also be more generally any behavior. When we are looking at someone performing a behavior, it is effectively a three-legged stool. So without one of these three things listed around performance, it falls apart. Without one of these three things, you can't perform it. So let me illustrate, or let me describe first. So motivation, you have to have the motivation, you have to have the drive to do something. You also have to have the ability to do it. So I may have the drive to get to the moon, but if I don't have the ability to be an aeronautical or aerospace engineer, then I'm probably not going to get to the moon. I also have to have the appropriate environment. I have to have a rocket to get to the moon. I have to have appropriate gear. I have to have the appropriate technology, the appropriate supplies. Without any of those three things, I can't perform getting to the moon. But if I have the motivation, so if I'm motivated to get to the moon, if I have the ability, I am an aeronautical or aerospace engineer with an advanced degree who's been working with NASA for many years and been training for many years, and I have the environment. So I have my rocket, I have my technology, and I have the supplies that I need, then I could theoretically get to the moon. But without one of these things, performance just won't happen. And it's the same in the workplace. An employee just performing their job has to have the motivation to do it. They also have to have the ability to do it, which gets into some of the things we talked about in our selection discussions and predicting performance. But we also have to have the environment. You know, you could have an employee who's super motivated, has the ability, but if your workplace isn't providing the environment for them to get things done, then then their performance will fall apart. And I have found in the past that students often misinterpret environment to mean climate in the organization. And while it's important, usually what we're talking about in environment is the tools that people need in order to do their jobs. What do you actually need to make sure that your ability and your motivation can be translated into performance? Not so much the culture and the climate of where you're working, though that is important, but not as important as, you know, do you have a computer? Do you have a phone? Do you have internet access to do your job? So before we get into this a little bit more, I want you to sit back for a quick moment and ask yourself, what do you think motivates people? So what do you think leads to differences in performance? So some of you may be saying to yourself, well, money. Money is what gets people to do their job. Some of you may be saying recognition. Some of you may be saying the feeling of a job well done. These are all things that motivate people. And based on our assumptions about what motivates people, it can influence the choices we make in an organization about how are we going to motivate people. Another question to ask yourself now is, how has COVID-19 changed how we motivate our employees? So we have to ask, how can we motivate people when they aren't at work? How can we motivate them? And in some ways related to something we talked about in the industrial psychology side of things, how do we assess performance and give feedback? We'll talk about this in a little bit, but performance assessment and feedback are critical to motivating people in the sense that if you're striving toward a particular goal or a particular end, you need to know how you're doing in that pursuit. And if you don't have feedback, then the whole system falls apart. And you need to assess performance in order to get feedback. But with COVID-19 and people working from home, or people having changed hours, or different working arrangements, they may find, both the employees and the organization, that our ways of motivating don't work anymore. So imagine, for instance, that you're Amazon. Ask yourself how Amazon can motivate its warehouse employees to even come and show up for work when we know that there have been large numbers of cases in Amazon warehouses, where Amazon warehouses are not known for their high levels of safety, though they would say otherwise. This is something that some of you encountered in doing the extra credit, and indeed it may be a question that you'll have to ask yourself when we get to assignment 2. So this is something to think about as we move on in the class and as we continue our discussion. So a bit of history. Your book brings this up very briefly, but organizational psychologists generally point to the Hawthorne studies as the place that we started our study of motivation. And I believe that this got brought up in our history of IO section as well. There were a lot of findings from the Hawthorne studies. Probably the most infamous is the one where the researchers went into the Hawthorne electric plant, I believe is what it's called. And they were looking at how can we motivate people? How can we get people to work faster, better, more efficiently, and more safely? And so one of the ideas was, well, let's give them better lighting. Let's keep some people working in a somewhat dark situation, and let's put some people working in a brighter situation. So the researchers put some people into a bright room and others into a dark room, or into a darker working space. And they found that it made no difference in the way that people worked. In fact, they found that the people working in the dark conditions were working just as hard as the people in the bright conditions. And that didn't make sense to them. But what they discovered and therefore concluded from their research was that the mere presence of the experimenters observing their performance, the workers' performance, caused the workers to work more quickly, work more efficiently, and work more safely. And this is something that's carried over to now. We all understand this phenomenon of, I work differently and better if I know I'm being watched by someone. And in that way, that can motivate our performance. So that was one conclusion that came from the Hawthorne studies. And for the record, the conclusion to take is not that, oh, I can keep my employees in darkness and that's good for them. It's not. But the idea was more, if someone's watching you, that's going to motivate you way more than any lighting condition. So motivation continues to be one of the most highly studied phenomena in organizational psychology. I believe a recent review by Ruth Canfer and her colleagues looked at this, and we just continue to find that motivation is something we are very interested in studying. So there are different perspectives on motivation. We have three themes here. One is need, motive, value, under which we'll talk about things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Cognitive choice, which includes something like reinforcement, which does not appear in your book, but I'm going to go over because I think it's important. And self-regulation, which includes things like goal setting, which is one of the most popular motivation theories, especially that is actually applied in the workplace. So let's talk about need, motive, value perspectives on motivation. This is also something that does not appear in your book, but I feel it would be helpful to include so you can understand how do needs work. So needs generally are actually considered an individual difference. So tying back to some of our selection and applicant assessment discussions, we can measure people's needs. So we can predict what kind of needs, or rather we can assess what kind of needs do our employees have or our future employees have, and how might that influence their performance. Now, a need generally, like I said, it's considered an individual difference, so it's relatively stable over time. Those situations can impact how it influences behavior. And it's usually an inner drive that influences and organizes our thoughts and feelings and behaviors, and effectively gives us a tendency, or is reflective of our internal tendency to be interested or motivated by certain factors. So to give you an example before we talk about some more specific examples, some of us have a need for achievement. So some of us are higher in a need to always achieve, to be in first place, to be accomplishing something, to be getting an A in a class. Some of us don't care about achievement. Some of us don't care about accolades. Some of us don't care about earning things in the sense of recognition and high levels of achievement. Some of us don't need to be at the top of the pyramid, but some of us do. And because of that, because we have differences in our needs for achievement, we can see how our different levels of needs will impact our behaviors. Now, when we're looking at our needs, when we are looking at what drives us, or rather, and this sometimes happens consciously, sometimes happens subconsciously, But when our needs get activated, it happens through a process of need deficiency. So basically, we look at the world around us and we realize, hey, my needs aren't being satisfied. If I have a need for achievement, so I have a need to achieve and need to perform at the best, to be earning accolades, to be in first place. And I realize that I'm not satisfying that need. I haven't been recognized in a really long time, or I haven't made some big achievement in a really long time. Then I need to do something about it. I need to satisfy that need. So I search for ways to do just that. So we have need deficiency first. I identify that my needs aren't being met or that my needs aren't being satisfied. And then I search for ways to identify that need. So I start to think about, once again, this can happen subconsciously or consciously. So we can be aware of it, or we can be unaware of it or aware of it, respectively. So we search for ways to satisfy those needs. So I may say to myself, okay, I want to feel some sort of achievement. I want to achieve something. I'm going to sign up for a marathon and run it. So I search for a way. Another way is I may say, you know what, I am going to go through the American Film Institute's top 100 films and write a little write-up on each of them. Or I'm finally going to finish a book that I've just been putting off and is really hard to finish, like The Brothers Karamazov. Something like that. And this can also happen at work. You may say, I'm going to strive to be employee of the month this month. That's going to be the way that I satisfy this need. So you then make a choice of goal-directed behaviors. So you presumably choose one of those goals, one of those ways that you're going to satisfy the need. So let's say I choose to run the marathon. So I then make some choices of behaviors that I am going to engage in order to pursue that end. So I might say, okay, I'm going to pick a training plan. I'm going to change my diet. I am going to run every day on the week and do a long run every weekend. And so those are the goal-directed behaviors. And the reason that we choose goal-directed behaviors is because without a specific choice of behaviors, we then can't really translate our needs to our need and our desire to satisfy it into action. So then we enact that behavioral choice. So we begin our diet and we begin our training plan and we run every day and do a long run every weekend. And then we experience rewards or punishment. So we either see that our needs are resulting in the outcomes that, or rather our behaviors are resulting in the outcomes that we want them to. So I'm running faster, I am running longer, or I'm not running, I got injured, or I'm tired all the time and I can't keep up with my training program. If I experience rewards, I may continue to pursue this marathon and presumably run it and finish it and feel that sense of achievement. Or if I get too many experiences of punishment, such as I can't train, I got injured, I'm exhausted, I gave up, then I have not satisfied that need. So this is a constant loop. So then I reassess my need deficiencies. If I feel like my need has been satisfied, let's say I successfully run the marathon, then my need has been satisfied. And it's only until I feel like that need isn't being satisfied anymore that we go through this again. But if I don't achieve the marathon, if I don't actually satisfy the need, then I go through this all again. So maybe I revisit, finishing the Brothers Karamazov or any of the other ways that I thought about satisfying this need. So this is how needs generally are thought to operate and how they influence our behaviors. There are 3 different needs-based perspectives that got brought up in the book. I'm going to go through each of them here. And the next one is, self-determination theory and intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is also considered to be a somewhat needs-based perspective, but we'll get to that in a moment. So ERG theory, we're going to start with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this one in the middle, because it's the one most of us are familiar with. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs argues that human beings have needs in a hierarchy. We have very basic needs, and then we have more higher level needs. Maslow argued that if you if you satisfy lower order needs, then you become more concerned with your higher order needs. So, for example, our lower order needs include things like physiological needs, so things like air, water, and food. followed by our security needs. So a need for shelter, a need for safety. Some would argue that, financial security would fall in here. So these are our more basic needs. Once we have satisfied, our more basic needs, then we can be concerned with some of our more higher order needs, like belongingness. So our need to belong, to have interpersonal relationships. It also, I think in the book, is labeled as love. I prefer to look at belongingness because it's more about just general interpersonal relationships, not necessarily love, because then people think it's romantic. Then following that, we have esteem needs. So our desire to feel good about ourselves, to feel like we are a worthwhile person, to be proud. And then that's finally followed by self-actualization needs. These are the highest level of needs you could be concerned with. And this is really about becoming the person that you want to be, the ideal person, the person that you see in your mind as the person who you want to be. And maybe some of you are saying, I'm exactly who I want to be, and that's great. But for some people, they aren't, so they're focused on that. But a critical conclusion from Maslow's hierarchy, and that's relevant to organizations today, especially under a pandemic, is that people will not be concerned with self-actualization, so becoming the best version of themselves, or even things like relational needs, like interpersonal needs, our desire to be friends with people, to have relationships, if they don't feel like they're safe, and if they feel like they are existentially threatened. So there are things like their health and well-being are being threatened. So one interesting question is, how do our needs then change under the condition of a pandemic? And how does that influence how we can motivate our employees when we are living with what is for some a life-threatening disease? There are other similar needs-based perspectives. One is also known as ERG theory, or Alderfer's ERG theory. We get ERG from existence, relatedness, and growth. So Alderfer argued that we have three different needs. And for the record, Maslow argued that only one need could really operate at a given time. Alderfer, or I'll just say ERG theory, the ERG theory hypothesizes or theorizes that these needs can operate at the same time. So you can be simultaneously motivated by growth, relatedness, and existence. That it's really hard to find someone who isn't all at once concerned. Yes, I'm concerned about becoming the person I am, but if my finances become threatened, of course I'm concerned about making sure I can put a roof over my head. So in terms of mapping these onto Maslow's hierarchy, because there's a lot of similar stuff going on here, we have existence needs, which relate to security and physiological needs, relatedness needs, which get at belongingness needs, and then growth needs, which are related to or similar to self-actualization and esteem needs. Another interesting thing from ERG theory is that there is a frustration regression hypothesis. So Maslow believed more that if you don't have a need satisfied, you just continue to try to satisfy that need. Alderfer argued that if you become frustrated at a higher level, though these can all operate at the same time, so let's say you're focused on your growth needs, but you've satisfied your relatedness and existence needs, if you keep being frustrated at this higher level, then you're just going to focus on your lower level needs, and it continues to regress. So in that way, you don't continue to try to satisfy a need if you keep failing at satisfying it, if that makes sense. Maslow, on the other hand, argued that you just kept trying and trying and trying. Another factor on needs in the workplace relates to the dual structure approach, or Herzberg's two-factor theory. So we'll call it two-factor here. I've called it dual structure in the past. But the two-factor theory argues that there are certain factors that will lead to satisfaction of your employees and presumably high levels of performance. And then there are certain factors that will just make sure that your employees are basically just not dissatisfied. And those are two different things, right? Having an employee who's not dissatisfied is different than having an employee who is satisfied. And the factors that make sure that your employees have the bare level of satisfaction are different than those that make sure that they are fully satisfied and therefore performing at their best. So those factors that just make sure they have the bare minimum level of satisfaction, or rather make sure that they aren't dissatisfied, are called hygienes. These once again get at things like security needs and physiological needs that an employee who works in a safe organization that is, providing their base salary is not dissatisfied. But an organization that's actually concerned with things like self-actualization, esteem, and belongingness, so these relatedness factors, these interpersonal relationships, making sure that employees are becoming their self-actualized person, those things are actually going to make your employee fully motivated, fully satisfied. So in that way, when you are developing your own company or working for a company, you need to make sure that your employees are not just having their more basic needs met, because you do find some people who say, well, all I need to do is provide them with a safe place to work and money and they're fine. Well, then you might just have people who are not dissatisfied and doing the bare minimum level of work. Compare that to the situation where you have people who are organizations that are not only satisfying these hygiene factors, but also concerned with these motivating factors, these motivators, these things like, do my employees feel like their workplace is a good place to make relationships and develop themselves interpersonally? So those are three of the needs-based perspectives. Another perspective that is somewhat grounded in needs is what's known as the job characteristics model. The job characteristics model basically is from Hackman and Oldham, and it's one of the most well-used and pretty well-researched area of organizational psychology. Is that so it's one of the most well-developed areas of organizational psychology. And the idea of the job characteristics model is that the characteristics of the work, so everything up until here has been more individual based, so there is some situational factor going on here that leads to an employee being motivated. This here is a little bit of both, where we're rather looking at the employee's growth needs, so their actual needs, as well as though the situations that can lead to an employee being more motivated. And this is based on how can we design a job that is going to, in the work itself, motivate employees. So we're not focused so much on the organizational culture and context. We're looking at the actual work that people do. Okay, so what are these characteristics then? So I'm going to focus on what these things when they are present mean, not when they are absent. So skill variety refers to when a job allows an employee to exercise a number of different skills. So are they allowed to leverage their interpersonal skills, their decision making, a different variety of skills. Task identity I've seen defined a couple of ways. One way it's defined is that an employee can point to what they have done and what they have worked on, so they can say, that's the thing I did. I've also seen some people say something similar, but it's more that an employee is responsible for a whole unit of work. So in that way, so like they're responsible for something from beginning to end. So in that way, they can say that is something that I was responsible for. And so two ways, but the conclusion is still the same. As long as an employee can say that is something I was responsible for, then they experience task identity. Task significance, on the other hand, is feeling like the work that the person is doing is has meaning, has impact on someone or something else that's meaningful. Then we have autonomy. Autonomy is something we've brought up in the past. It's going to be brought up again here. Autonomy gets at, do you feel like you have your own freedom to do what you want to do for your job, or rather how you do your job? So do you feel like there's only one way to do it and you have to do it that way, or do you have some flexibility and therefore self-determination in how you do what you do? Then we have feedback, which is exactly what it sounds like. Does the job provide knowledge of the results of the work that you're doing? Do you get feedback in the work that you are doing? So all of these things influence critical psychological states. So skill variety, task identity, and task significance lead to more experience, meaningfulness in work. So experience your work is meaningful. Autonomy leads to greater experienced responsibility for what you are doing. And then feedback is, as I said, knowledge of the actual results of the work. All of these lead to these desirable outcomes. High internal work motivation, which we'll get to in a little bit with intrinsic motivation, but this is basically high levels of motivation, high quality performance, high satisfaction, low absenteeism, and turnover. So in short, if we have jobs that have great skill variety, have task identity, have task significance, have autonomy, and have feedback, then employees are going to experience these critical psychological states that lead to these desirable outcomes. These are things that we want in an organization. Now, of course, this is going to be moderated to the extent the employee has a growth need. So for some employees, they don't really have a strong desire to develop. Talked about this earlier, but some people just don't really care about actually developing and becoming a better employee and becoming a better person. And so in that way, if you have an employee who's low on these growth needs, then these aspects of the job might actually not be that influential in how they perform their work. So this is also relevant to some of what I talked about earlier about how motivation can be related to selecting employees for different positions and different jobs. So you may say, well, I'm going to put employees who have low growth needs into positions that do not have these things because they're unlikely to be impacted by them anyway. So you may want to put people who are low on growth needs in assembly line work, because assembly line work, for the most part, doesn't involve a lot of skill variety, a lot of task identity, really not a lot of significance, autonomy, or feedback. That can change, but you may say, look, I'm putting people on the worst kind of jobs who have low growth needs, and people who are high on growth needs in jobs that involve these things. So that's how it all kind of ties together. The reason this is important to consider is it's important for organizations to understand which kinds of jobs are likely to produce these desirable outcomes and which ones are not. So Amazon warehouse workers, for example, I'll turn back to Amazon a few times today because I know you all said you wanted some more practical examples. Amazon warehouse workers do a lot of the same work every day. And the research, or rather the reporting by outlets like the New York Times and the Huffington Post, is that these positions have an insane level of turnover, a lot of dissatisfaction with the work, but we do tend to see high motivation and high performance, which we will talk about a little bit more about why that could happen. But one of the reasons that we probably see low satisfaction and low absenteeism, or rather low satisfaction and high turnover, is those jobs don't have a lot of skill variety. You're also very much told how to do your job. You're monitored. If you take so much as a bathroom break in the wrong restroom, in the sense that you didn't go to the restroom they thought you should have gone to, you get a demerit. So these jobs have a high level of feedback, but they probably don't actually have a large amount of task significance, because yeah, you're getting a box together, but doesn't really feel like you're making a huge difference by sending someone their most recent copy of Twilight. I don't know. That would be interesting to study. In task identity, you may have some level of that, but certainly skill variety, task significance, and autonomy are very low in these jobs. So in that way, Amazon may be asking ourselves, well, what can we do to limit our turnover? Though some may argue that Amazon's business model is contingent actually on a high level of turnover, so they don't actually have to start paying employees benefits and a decent wage. But assuming Amazon didn't want a ton of turnover, maybe we would start to ask ourselves, okay, well, how can we change the autonomy portion here? How can we change? Can't really change skill variety. This job is always going to be boring in terms of the skills that you would use in it. But maybe we can change task significance. We can make it more apparent that they are having a positive impact on people, or give them more autonomy in how they do what they do. So just one way that we could apply some of these theories in reality. Another somewhat needs-based theory, but it's also an internal motivation-based theory, is self-determination theory. I love self-determination theory. I've been reading about it and studying it since I was in your shoes, since I was in undergrad, because I did research starting as a sophomore in college and haven't stopped. In which, by the way, if any of you are interested in doing research in psychology, reach out to me. There are opportunities for undergrads to participate in research here. Beyond just showing up to the lab and doing the studies. You can actually be a part of running the studies or go to grad school. But anyway, I love self-determination theory because it's so simple. So self-determination theory argues that we have three needs, and we brought this up at the beginning of class, if you remember, in our research methods section. So self-determination theory argues we have three needs: competence, autonomy, and relatedness. We have a need for competence, which means we want to feel like we're doing something competently, we're doing it well, so that we're completing a task and we're completing that task as it should be done. We also want autonomy. You all should be familiar with this at this point. Autonomy means that we have the freedom and independence to do things how we want. Then we have needs for relatedness. So we can't forget, we still have needs to be interpersonally connected with people. We always want to have some sort of level of human connection. It is a biological, instinctive drive. We can't live without other people. You wouldn't survive. So in that way, we have these three needs. Now, when these needs are satisfied, Ryan and DC argue that it results in what's known as intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is the kind of motivation we generally want our employees to have. It's where they are motivated to do an activity because they enjoy doing it, because they want to do it. And here's an opportunity for some just self-reflection. What is something that you enjoy doing that someone wouldn't have to pay you to do? Or if you won the lottery, what would you do with the remainder of your days if you were to pick a job to do for the remainder of your days in spite of winning the lottery? For me, it's writing. I love to write. If I won the lottery, I would maybe keep this job, but I would also do a lot more just creative writing. I could write all day. So ask yourself, what is something that you don't need to be paid to do, that you don't really need to be motivated to do, because the activity itself, the enjoyment you get doing it, that motivates you to do it. So now you've probably thought of, okay, that's the thing I'm intrinsically motivated to do. The reason we want intrinsic motivation is because, returning to the earlier slide, we have found that intrinsic motivation, people who are rather intrinsically motivated, tend to put forth more effort, and they tend to sustain that effort longer, and it tends to be more, therefore, sustainable in the long term, because the person is almost their own self-driving machine. As an employer, I don't have to do much to motivate someone who's intrinsically motivated. They're going to do it on their own, and they're going to do it better, and they're going to do it for a longer amount of time. So you want people who are intrinsically motivated. On the other hand, though, we have situations that don't satisfy these needs. And so we can experience extrinsic motivation. This is where we are completely motivated by things outside of our control, or rather outside of ourselves. So this is those situations of, you would have to pay me to do that. So sit back and ask yourself, what is something that I would not do unless someone paid me a lot of money to do? You know, there are probably a lot of things that you wouldn't do if unless someone paid you an exorbitant amount of money. In that way, we would be extrinsically motivated. And some of you may say, that's how I feel about my job. I only do it for the money. In that way, you are extrinsically motivated. The reason why, as employers, we don't necessarily want that is because people who are extrinsically motivated just don't perform as well as people who are intrinsically motivated. And it's not a bad thing to be extrinsically motivated. We've all been there in various points in our lives, being extrinsically motivated to do stuff. But it just means that as employers, we need to be aware, are our employees doing things because they truly, genuinely enjoy the activity, or because we're paying them to do it? Because that will influence their performance on the job. Of course, there is a continuum in between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. I won't go through that in this class because it gets really complicated and is like very splitting of hairs. But if you're saying, well, what if I'm somewhere in between these things? That does exist. Brian and DC have acknowledged that, for example, doing things for praise, that's not as extrinsically motivated as doing something for money, but it's not as intrinsically motivating as doing something because we enjoy the activity itself. Okay. So a couple of notes about self-determination theory that are really important. Generally, researchers have found that introducing external rewards for activities can occasionally undermine intrinsic motivation. Now, your book presents a study, I believe it was from China, where they found that controlled motivation did not really negatively impact performance or need satisfaction. And so it can be a little bit complicated, but generally what researchers, including myself, have recommended is that you have to be really careful about the extent to which you are potentially undermining your employees' intrinsic motivation. The story gives a very, quote unquote, or sorry, rather the textbook gives a really cute story about a guy who pays kids to play in front of his house, and once he stops paying them, they stop playing in front of his house because they started to play in front of his house, not because they wanted to, but for the money. And by doing so, he actually leveraged, the intrinsic motivation principles to get something to stop. But as employers, we may say, the best way to increase my employees' motivation is to give them more rewards, to give them more money. And in fact, many of us have had probably conversations where we say, I don't care what they do, I just want to be paid more. And that's really reflective of some of the stuff we talked about with Maslow's hierarchy or ERG theory and whatnot, as well as the hygiene and motivation factors. But one of the other ways we could motivate our employees without necessarily resorting to external means is through addressing things like providing our employees opportunities to demonstrate their competence, providing them autonomy to do their work, providing them opportunities to develop relatedness with others, or rather satisfy their relatedness needs. Now, to spell it out more clearly, research has often shown that when you introduce external rewards to people who are already intrinsically motivated, you basically undercut their intrinsic motivation and get rid of it. So to give an example outside of the workplace, this happens with paying kids for grades. You may say to yourself, if you aren't already a parent, well, I'm going to pay my kids for grades. Or you may ask, well, why didn't my mom and dad pay me, but some of my classmates got paid for their grades? As a psychologist, I strongly recommend against this, because what happens is if you have a kid who is already intrinsically motivated to learn, to work, to do well in school, but you pay them for their grades, they start to do it for the money. And what we know based on research is that extrinsic motivation generally is not as sustaining and does not produce as high performance as intrinsic motivation. So if you are a parent and you have a child who is already intrinsically motivated, don't pay them. Give them things like praise, maybe, or you can, we'll revisit this in a second. You can, encourage them in other ways and give them, appropriate acknowledgement. But this is the critical thing that now as employers we can take away, is that obviously we need to, pay our employees, and in that way that is a reward. But we need to make sure that what we are rewarding our employees with, or our children with, is not so coercive effectively that people start to do it for the reward. This might be, for example, why Amazon, in one of the articles I signed for the extra credit, I believe it talks about how Amazon warehouse workers have these power hours where they are supposed to work super hard for an hour, and their reward is usually something like a cookie. Some people may think, hey, that's really insulting. Other people may say, well, I don't want to over reward them, because then they'll start doing it for the reward instead of doing it for, because they're intrinsically motivated to do it. So in that way, they may actually be leveraging good motivational practices. On the other hand, they may just be cheapskates who don't want to actually properly compensate their employees. So takeaways from here: if you satisfy these needs, it leads to intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is generally more self-sustaining, produces better performance than extrinsic motivation. If you want to introduce some sort of reward, you have to make sure that it isn't so coercive that it will undercut an employee's intrinsic motivation or applied outside the workplace, your children's motivation to do well. Same with chores. Same with anything in life, really. Don't try to reward people if they're already doing something. Give them praise, give them recognition, give them an appropriate salary, but always make sure that however you are rewarding them doesn't result in a coercive structure where they are just doing it for the reward and no longer doing it because they enjoy it. There are, of course, other needs. I mentioned these at the top of this section. Need for achievement. I've already mentioned this is a need for accomplishment. People who are high in the need for achievement often seek feedback. They're preoccupied with their work. They assume a lot of responsibility when getting things done. We know a lot of interesting things about people who are high in a need for achievement. We find that they often choose activities that generally have a 50-50 chance of, usually have activities that they have, that aren't so easy that they don't get a lot of satisfaction from completing it, but aren't so hard that they run the risk of failing because they also fear failure. So usually they go for things that have roughly a 50-50 chance of success. So it's hard enough that they can feel accomplished, but it's not so hard that they're going to run a high risk of failure. There's also a couple of other needs that haven't really been studied as much, though. My colleagues and I are actually about to submit a paper about this need listed right here in the middle, need for affiliation. Need for affiliation is just like the belongingness and relatedness needs that we've been talking about. This is your need to have interpersonal relationships, interpersonal connections. My colleagues and I are about to submit a paper where we found that CEOs who are higher in a need for affiliation are more likely to engage in alliances than CEOs who are low in a need for affiliation. Need for power, on the other hand, is just a need for control. It's a need for just that, a need to have power over other people. It hasn't been studied as much as a need for affiliation, and definitely not as much as need for achievement. So that's all we can really say on that. So I think I'm going to stop here. You all said that you wanted some shorter lecture videos. So here's the first one. It'll end, and we'll just pick up with cognitive choice in the next one.